Good morning, Iowa. I've always been interested in how school funding works, but that's intensified a lot lately. Since we continue to talk about it, I wanted to understand as much as I could how exactly it works. So here's what I've learned. To understand how school funding in Iowa works, first you'll need to get comfortable with two terms. The first is cost per pupil, which is exactly what it sounds like, how much funding is allocated per student. The second term is allowable growth rate, which is the percent that the current year's cost per pupil will increase for next year. Understanding those components become easier when you look at this graph. And if you're digging into school funding, you're going to look at this chart a lot. A lot. The chart breaks down funding based on three primary sources. A uniform levy, which is specific to property taxes, $5.40 for every $1,000 assessed. Second is state aid, which evens the playing field for property poor districts. Combined, the uniform levy and state aid make up the foundation level, which is 87.5% of student cost per policy. And while state aid is designed to help even the field, it doesn't do it all. There's an additional levy that provides the remaining 12.5% with tax rates specific to what each district's required to provide to get the cost per pupil. Unfortunately for Iowa schools, when we talk about that 1% increase, it applies only to this portion of the funding. It does not include the additional revenue from other state and federal sources. And it's this cost per pupil that's applied to all assets and resources that help educate all of the students in the school. But it's not the only funding schools get. Each district has multiple other sources of revenue, from things like PPEL, Pearl, SAVE, and additional state money to incentivize teachers for leadership roles, to accommodate special ed students, assist ELL students, and even more. Last, and actually in this case least of all, each district receives a small portion of funding from the federal government. So, only the state cost per pupil of funding qualifies for increases in that allowable growth rate. So let's make this more real by looking at two actual examples. And because digging through the detail on these is ridiculous, I'm picking two very disparate districts that I'm familiar with. The first, where I went to school, Moravia Community School District. The second is where my kids go, Ankeny Community School District. All of these figures are from the 2017-2018 allocation summary. Links to all of this below as well. And the Moravia Community School District has a total cost per pupil of $11,365. Ankeny has a total cost per pupil of $10,285. So while there's a difference, both of them receive the same amount from the state, $6,664, which is what funds most instruction in classrooms. So what accounts for the difference? Well, on a per-student basis, Ankeny receives an additional $659 for supplemental weighting, and special ed gets lumped into that aid and levy package. Ankeny also gets $1,505 in local revenue and $1,363 in state revenue, and federal revenue comes in at a whopping $95. On the same per-student basis, Moravia receives an additional $1,164 for supplemental weighting and special ed added to the aid and levy package. Moravia also gets $1,603 in local revenue and an additional $1,528 in state revenue. And finally, they get $406 per student from the federal government. So that's where the money comes from. But remember, the $6,664 is the only amount that applies directly to the education of every student. That other local revenue from PPL, Pearl, education improvement, and other stuff like that doesn't go to every student. That other state revenue goes towards early intervention programming and teacher leadership support, professional development, and special education. And that federal funding applies mostly to Title I grants and teacher quality improvements. And while you can take all of the funding a district gets and divide it by students, it doesn't mean that all students are benefiting from the money that's included. Your kid, in fact, might not be getting any of those extras at all. So, every year the Iowa legislature does this same song and dance around deciding how much to increase cost per pupil via that allowable growth rate. But all we're talking about is the $6,664 from earlier. To set the cost per pupil for the following year, the legislature must agree on an allowable growth rate. And though knowing how much money a school is going to get is an important thing, our state leadership has reduced the amount of lead time in their AGR decision from 2 years down to a mere 30 days out from the governor's annual budget reveal. That's not helpful for schools. A 1% increase for the 2018-2019 school year is both fiscally responsible based on cratering state revenues, but also socioeconomically reckless. Since you made it this far, you might be wondering, how does that 1% compare to the good old days, like when you and I were in school? Well, this graphic shows allowable growth rates since 1974. Notice in particular the shift from earlier years when allowable growth rate was set using a calculation driven by economic indicators to the post-1992 growth rates, which became a reactionary decision made by the Iowa legislature. It goes without saying, pretty quickly after that change, the educational tax burden to Iowans compared to the rest of the nation went down pretty dramatically. However, at the same time, many other states were increasing their spending per student to account for increasing complexities in modern education. The increased volume of coursework and the variety of technological applications necessary for learning has only continued to balloon and add costs. We all think of Iowa as having a brand connected with education, but how much of that is memory instead of reality? Truth is, educational spending in Iowa has increased in the last decade, but the majority of it has been for needed building upgrades and additions to gyms and stadiums. Don't get me wrong, building upgrades enhance students' learning environments, and modern gymnasiums are important to communities. Small towns, many of which exist solely because of their school district, are brought together through athletics, which help towns build collective identities and establish cultural cohesion. Nice new gyms also make some money, so that's helpful. But gyms and stadiums are a different spin than resources specific to learning in the classroom. When national studies look at what states spend on students, those kinds of things are factored in, like a certain 20.6% number that keeps being used to compare Iowa to other states. But the truth is that 20.6% isn't grounded in pure education expenses. And another reason we've done so well compared to other states is that almost a dozen other states have killed their school funding by modernizing their income tax rates to almost zero. That's something that's currently being pushed through the Iowa State House as well. Most honestly, the hardest part of trying to make a case for or against the allowable growth rate increases is everything is shrouded in chaos. Just understanding the funding is difficult, but understanding if it's a good value, good luck. Performance is measured across dozens of conflicting and constantly changing variables. But I think that the bankruptcy of educational systems happens in the same way Hemingway explained bankruptcy in general. It happens slowly and then all at once. Iowans working in education are strong-willed, with a bend but don't break attitude, and our schools and staffs have been bending and bending and bending for years now. Where are we going from here? Only time will tell. Oh, and if you like this video, you can subscribe to my channel to be notified when I post more of this kind of stuff. If you have a topic you want me to explore, put it in the comments. I'd appreciate it. Now, go be awesome.